Right, hello everyone. I'm Eric and I am going to be talking about making music with Clojure and specifically the Overtone library. So real quick, I am just going to start up a Clojure REPL and grab Overtone. So in preparing for this talk, I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between music and math because people always told me that they're really related. And you know, I've had a fair amount of math in my life and less music, but I never really got that connection all the way. But I did, in preparing for this talk, start to see a connection between programming and music, and that's going to load up real quick. In that both of these operate at a lot of different levels of abstraction. So in programming, you have everything from machine code running on the silicon to these high-level web frameworks or high-level languages. And in music, you have a lot of the similar series of abstractions. And so I could give this talk on like any level of abstraction there. Like I could give a talk on machine code or high-level programming language, and I'm going to be talking at a pretty low-level language of music. So what is a low level of music? Well, it's sound. And in its most basic form, sound is just vibrations of air at a given period. So a sine wave at a given frequency. And here I'm just demoing this sine wave, panning it between both speakers. It's a sine oscillator at a given frequency. And the frequency controls the pitch of the sound that you're going to be hearing. But when you're talking about music, you're usually not hearing just an individual sine wave. Usually what you're hearing is some composition of sine waves. So if I add two sine waves together, I get a nice composite tone, and I have what you could call a fundamental frequency, this lowest note, and an overtone, which is just an integer multiple of that frequency. So when you start to add these sounds together, you start to develop something that's a little bit more than a pure tone, and you can start abstracting this into the idea of an instrument. Let's make sure I spell this. Instrument. Def inst. Okay. And Overtone has this abstraction. There's a macro def inst, and I can name something here. I'm going to make an instrument that sounds like a chime or a bell, and I'll give it some arguments. It'll take a frequency with a default of 440, and I can start to use these abstractions. So I can let my fundamental be this frequency, and I can let a first overtone be a scalar multiple of the fundamental, and I can make a second and a third overtone, and I'll make that times 3, and this one's going to be times 6. It's a little higher. We'll get some high notes in there. And then with these bindings, I can create an instrument that just adds these sine waves together. So once these are all put together, I can create this instrument and call it, and I get a chime. And that's starting to sound a little bit more like a natural tone that we might expect from an instrument, and you know, we can give it the different notes and hear something different. But in reality, when you're ringing a bell, these overtones, they don't all have equal loudness. The fundamental is going to be a strong sound, and the really high notes are just going to be a little bit echoey. And that different loudness is the amplitude of the sine wave controls how loud it is. And to control that in overtone, we can just multiply these sine waves by some constant. So the fundamental will be 1. The first overtone will be a pretty big portion of the sound. The second is going to be a pretty small portion, and this third is going to be really tiny comparably. And now the chime is starting to sound even more natural. But I said this was going to be kind of like a bell, and one of the interesting things about a bell tone is that the overtones aren't actually integer multiples of the fundamental frequency. They're a little bit off. And so when I make those multipliers here off from integers, it's going to sound a little bit discordant, but in a way that should be reminiscent of a bell. It's got a little ringing to it. So here I've abstracted from just a few additions of sine waves at different frequencies and kind of made an instrument. But there's more to it than just like adding sine waves together and having like a constant number of sine waves. When you play an instrument, normally there's some change in the loudness over time. Like you strike a bell and it's really loud at first and it decays, or you hit a cymbal and it's loud and then decays over time. You string a string across a bow and there's some attack that's slow and a sustained pitch and then it decays, and that's what we call an envelope. So I'm going to just really quickly show a demo of what an envelope can be. And in Overtone, we have this envelope generator, which takes a helper method that can construct an envelope for you. So this is going to be a linear envelope with a second of attack, 2 seconds of sustain, and 1 second of decay. And then I can just multiply that. As you can see here, I'm just multiplying this by whatever signal I want to wrap the envelope around. So in this case, a sine wave. And you see it comes in, sustains, and goes out. And I'm going to introduce another concept here real quick to build my next instrument. And so far we've talked about just a sine wave, but we can create more complicated waveforms. So like a triangle wave has a frequency still, but it has a different sound because the waveform is a little different. Or a saw wave is going to be a really tinny sound. And those take frequencies, but you can also create waveforms that don't have any frequency to it, like white noise. So I'm going to use this white noise and a envelope to make a percussion instrument, which should be a little bit different than a chime. So here, and this is, instead of having a frequency as an argument, I'm just going to use strum as an argument, which will affect the length of how long the hat is. I don't know why I'm calling it strum, but it made sense. So let's see. So we'll start off with our envelope. And instead of a linear envelope here, I'm going to use the percussion helper. And I'm not going to have any attack. It's just going to be right away, and then it's going to decay at the rate of the strum. And then I have another argument here, curve, which is going to control how quickly it decays. And then I can just combine that with my white noise. And I have a hi-hat. And if I strum it for a little longer, sounds kind of like a hi-hat. But it doesn't sound exactly like a hi-hat, but it sounds a little too low. A real hi-hat is tinier. And so far I've been talking about additive synthesis, like adding sine waves together to make sound. But there's another form of synthesis where you can chop off portions of your sine wave, subtractive synthesis. So I can put a high-pass filter over this white noise, which is just only going to let through frequencies above the frequency that I put in, so 9,000. So this should make our hi-hat a little tinier. So it's a little softer, so I can, also multiply it by 2 to make it a little louder. And yeah, that sounds tinny like a hi-hat. So I'm actually just going to grab another instrument that I made real quick here to demonstrate, but not type out by hand. It's a bass, and here it uses some of the same concepts. We're starting with the fundamental. We have a series of overtones and a series of weights to those overtones, and I'm just going to, create the frequencies by mapping multiplication between these, and I'll create sine waves with the given frequencies and weights. And here I have an envelope. This is the interesting part. It's a linear envelope with a nice slow attack, a nice medium length sustain, and a low release. And that should sound, the particular construction of these weights and this envelope should make this sound a little bit like a stringed instrument. And that's a high note. And so for the bassier sound, and I can kick this up a notch if that's hard to hear. So yeah, that's a nice stringy sound. So far we've talked about frequencies kind of as a static input, like you have a single frequency that you're defining an instrument with. But one of the interesting things about instruments and music is that the frequency can change small amounts over time. And think of a vibrato, someone who's singing with a deep, rich note that's kind of warbling around a given frequency. And so, as a synthesis tool, Overtone doesn't have to just take a constant 440 here. It can actually take a something that varies over time. And since we have these waveform generators, it's really easy to just vary this 440 over time. So I can add in an oscillator there, and if you listen closely, you can maybe hear a little bit of change in that note over time. But if I multiply it by some constant, you can really hear that. So I'm going to use that basic principle, and I'm going to define an instrument that I'm going to call a choir, but it's going to be more of an alien choir, I'm going to warn you. And it's going to have some frequency as an argument, and a duration, and as part of this choir, I'm going to do a little bit simpler number of overtones. So I'm going to still have my fundamental, and I'm going to have just a perfect fifth as the other waveform that I'm going to be using, and that's just the fundamental times 3 halves, which, if anyone's had some music theory, that might mean something to you. It doesn't mean a ton to me, but it works. And so I can start off by just adding these together. And I'm going to use the triangle wave that I demonstrated earlier to give this a little more interesting tone. So I'm just going to start with this so we can hear it without any changes. And that's a pretty uninteresting note. But if I add a vibrato frequency argument, we'll say it's gonna vibrate at 5 hertz, and the vibrato magnitude will go 13. Then I can add that in, so the fundamental plus a sine oscillator at the vibrato frequency, which I'm going to multiply by the vibrato magnitude. Let's see, did I get my parens right here? Okay, that looks right. Actually, no, it doesn't. There we go. And then do the same thing over here. Line these up. Okay. Yeah. And now you can see we've added a vibrato in. But more than that, we don't have to just control the frequency. We can also toss in another argument to this pan2 function, which I said outputs it to both speakers, but in reality, we can cause it to move between the two speakers. So if I just have a sine oscillator in here, should be bouncing back and forth between them. And that's a little too extreme for me, so I'm just going to change this so, oh no, I just want to multiply this by a little bit smaller constant. And a little bit of bounce. And finally, I'm going to control not just the pitch and the pan with a sine oscillator, but I am going to add in some tremolo. So I can adjust the amplitude of all this over time, which I don't think I did that right. Let's see, parens. Sorry guys, my Python is showing. Okay, so I'm going to multiply the whole volume by a sine oscillator. And let's see, yeah, that works. And you can hear the volume fade in and out. And I don't really want it to fade all the way in and out, so I'm just going to multiply this again by a constant. And subtract 1 from it, so that, there we go. No. Yeah. So there we go, we've got a little weird choir to go on. So now I've produced a bunch of notes, I've created some different instruments, but you're probably thinking that's not quite music yet, it's just some sounds. And so the fundamental next abstraction to music is that I need to be able to do things in sequence, create sequences of notes that you could use to build a composition. And so to do that, I can just define a function. I'm just going to define a function to play a pattern. And that's going to take the current time, a separation time, a sequence to play, and a sound to play for the sequence. And Overtone has some nice features to play sounds at a given time. And so I can play at the current time when the first value of my sequence is anything but null, I can apply my sound to the first of my sequence. And then I can let the new time be my current time plus my separation. So I'm just going to recurse now on the same function over the rest of the sequence. So I'm bumping my time up 1, and then I have this other nice overtone function apply by, which by the new time I'm going to do the same function. So a little bit before it'll run this function so that the at is running before the time where it has to schedule the next sound. So everything will work out nicely. And so I'll do my play pattern at the new time with the same separator, the rest of my sequence, and the same sound. And that should let me play a pattern. So let's play now about 200 milliseconds apart. we're going to play a pattern. That's going to be my pattern. We're going to play it on the hi-hat. And my pattern are just going to be arguments to the hi-hat function. So nothing, and then I'll toss some nils, and I'll have a strum of 0.05, and then nil, nil, nothing, nil, and so I've got a little pattern there. And if I wanted this to repeat, I can just cycle through it. You can probably hear that's gonna repeat for pretty much ever. And Justin's gonna turn up my volume for me. Yeah, crank it. All right. So that's nice to play one pattern, but ideally I'd like to play more than one pattern at once and layer some things on here. So I can define a quick function to play all, which is just going to take a separator time and some collection of patterns. I'll let the starting time be a little bit in the future. And then I will just do a sequence of things, and I'll just destructure sound and pattern from my patterns. And the sequence of thing I'm gonna do is just play pattern. T, set T, whoop. Pattern and sound. So, what'd I do? Def as. Yeah, great. And so now I have a bunch of patterns that I'm going to just pull in here real quick. So I've got a hat sequence here, which is just a series of notes. I've got a bass sequence, which is playing some long bass notes with some rests in between. I've got a chime sequence, which is going to repeatedly choose some random notes from our chime with the possibility of resting. And a choir sequence, which if we meet a certain condition, so randomly, we may or may not play a random note with a random duration, otherwise we'll just rest. And so now I can play all of these. Hi-hat is my sound, and hat sequence, we're gonna cycle this. Bass is my sound, bass sequence, and we're gonna cycle that. Chime, chime, seek should cycle on its own. Choir, choir sequence should cycle on its own. And, what did I do wrong? Oh, I need a separator time. We'll go 300 milliseconds. Live coding. And now, I forgot a couple very important things. So, we never put an envelope on this chime, so each one of those is playing a new note, so I can toss a quick envelope on here, which we'll toss a linear envelope on here with no attack, a brief sustain, and a duration of fall, and we'll add a duration argument on here. Let's see, do I have an envelope on the rest of these? Does choir have an envelope? Oh, I should evaluate this. Let's see. No. So I can do another quick envelope with short attack, short sustain, and the duration release again. That should work, and now this should be a little less ugly. Yeah, there we go. Now we have a kind of uninteresting, but a complete random generative composition a la Brian Eno or some other famous ambient musician, right? And that'll just keep playing, and we did all of that in 100 lines of code, building up from sine waves for the most part, and building our own sequencer. So we, building up from the smallest level of abstraction, we can create a generative piece of music. And I'll spare you guys.